Helena, I know that was lots of words, lots of numbers for people, but whether you're looking at growth, productivity growth, of course, growth, whether you're looking at the costs of servicing the public debt, whether you're looking at the ability of the government to cut spending or increase taxes, it's all really bad for Rachel. It's bad from the perspective of being popular, and it's bad from the perspective of just actually working. And clearly, Labour aren't in a place to make difficult decisions around taxing the ultra-rich. Can she survive the whole of 2025, do you think?
I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely because the nitty-gritty of the economic realities of what the country looks like at the moment are being blamed on Rachel Reeves when, of course, I believe that a lot of her decisions can be blamed on her. But the situation that the country finds itself in cannot be blamed on her. It can be blamed, as you pointed out, on previous governments at times of low interest rates not engaging in the capital investment that she is currently investing in. Again, not to the extent that I would want to. I would want the fiscal rules to be different in terms of the way that it calculates net assets rather than net financial liabilities, to be able to allow more access to more capital investment while still sticking within those fiscal rules. I believe the fiscal rules could be much looser than they currently are, given the state of our economy, which no one's investing in terms of FDI because they can't guarantee a return, because no one can afford to spend because the incomes of consumers have been squeezed so much over the last however many years. Your point on productivity is a really important one too, and the fact that there was a really great article by Francis Coppola the other day looking at the reality that the share of GDP growth that we've had, what little growth that we've had since 2010, pretty much all of it comes from an increased labor input, i.e., there are more people working and producing rather than the existing number of people working, producing more. That's what's called total factor productivity, i.e., the amount of extra productive capacity that's created from making labor and capital do more, i.e. innovative investments, for example, which we've not had because things such as R&D development have been completely gutted by austerity, which could have been increased when interest rates were low. So our productivity problem has meant that we've had to rely on migration and we can't invest in public services because we've not engaged in capital investment at a time when it was cheap. So a lot of the situations that we're in are outside of Reeves's control, especially when a lot of our gilt yields are very tied to geopolitical instability, given our close Atlanticist relationship with America, given that we've cut ourselves off from Europe, which is also making inflation worse because of the fact that we are less likely to trade with our closest neighbors and are trying to go further afield with all these other trade deals with India or Vietnam, United States, wherever it might be, which is actually less good at importing cheaper goods to ensure that we can keep the cost of living low. These are all things, again, completely outside of Rachel Reeves' control at time of recording. What's also outside of her control is that Labour have essentially cut off their ability to be able to deal with the financial shortfall that might be coming due to increased gilt yields and due to the fact that there is very little in terms of room that they can engage in extra taxation. And that was a decision that was made by people like Morgan McSweeney and Pat McFadden for political reasons in the run-up to the election. One of the easy levers to generate extra funding if she wants to stick within her fiscal rules, for example, on expenditure on day-to-day, so operational expenditure, matching tax receipts, which the NIESR predict will need to be, as you say, 40 billion extra by 2028, 2029. The major levers have all been turned off because McSweeney felt we can't get elected if we say we're going to increase income tax, even if it's on the wealthiest, right? Like, most people didn't really disagree with the extra tax on the top 5% proposed by Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in 2017 and 2019. There was that famous clip of the guy in the Question Time audience who looked massively out of touch because he earned over 80k and he felt like he was the median income earner when he just isn't. Most people look at an 80k earner and think that they're rich and don't mind them seeing them taxed more. But that's shut off for political reasons. And Rachel Reeves, whether or not she's part of that decision or not, I don't know. That was a political decision that's been taken, which is now in an economic reality where they need to find more taxes. Where I think that she's not going to last the rest of the year is that to fulfill this shortfall, she's either going to damage her reputation with Labour voters, which is already on thin ice as people don't like her over PIP cuts and over winter fuel cuts, which were her fault. Those decisions made as Chancellor, right? Like, these are things that are completely indefensible. I mean, the disability cuts that she was trying to push were depraved, quite frankly. That's already cut her off with Labour voters, but austerity isn't what they want anymore if they do cuts to try and deal with this shortfall to match those fiscal rules. And if she wants to start doing all these other taxes to try and fulfill that gap without going to the big levers that she's already turned off, it's going to have to be loads of nickel and diming taxes. That's going to be bad in the media regardless, because the media are the ones who'll get hit by it because they're more likely to be wealthy people who pay these other kinds of tax, like national insurance on rental income or on capital gains or on dividends taxation or on what the other ones they've already done, like private schools, which journalists already got pretty mad about. And the more nickel and dime taxes you do, the more you look like a tax raiser, because that's multiple headlines rather than just one increase on income tax for like the higher rate or the extra rate on top of that, if they did it for the top 5%. So there is no good choices here as far as Rachel Reeves is concerned, given that she's already set her own straitjacket by the current set of fiscal rules. I think there's a perfectly reasonable example that you could make extra deficit spending on operational expenditure in the NHS. I don't think that necessarily has to come from taxation, because it's a pro-growth measure to get people who are sick into work. That will increase productivity, that will increase taxable returns, whilst coming from operational expenditure anyway, which doesn't have any extra capital investment that's relevant. But she can't make that argument because she's already set herself into that box of having to make overall operational expenditure be equal to taxable income. So there's precious little that she can do, where both the international situation that she's inherited, the previous poor decisions of the coalition government and onwards, she's inherited that too, and she has no choice in how she engages in changes to taxation because of people like McSweeney and McFadden. I should feel at least somewhat of a sympathy towards her because of these situations outside of her control. But she was the one who allied herself with this neoliberal political project from McSweeney, McFadden, Starmer, Labour together. I mean, she was one of the central figures of Labour together. So in that regard, she has nobody to blame but herself.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. I mean, some of the people in the comments are saying you can just print money, get Richard Murphy on MMT. I don't agree with lots of that. I have to be quite frank with you. The United States, because of imperialism, the US can do that. The US can print infinity dollars, and they can effectively borrow from the rest of the world, selling those dollars, i.e. giving them treasuries, and that can fund loads of stuff domestically because the United States is an unrivaled global military hegemon. Britain doesn't have that. When we want to import food and energy, by the way, we have to import loads of those things. Your currency not massively devaluing kind of matters, kind of important. The rules are a bit different for the US, or very different, I should say, for the US. They're rather different for China as well. But the UK, as a big net importer of energy, big net importer of food, I'm sorry, I don't agree with those interpretations. Yes, if you want to talk about the United States, yes, that's broadly correct. It's not true for the UK. Otherwise, if you think that any country can just embark on a project of MMT, irregardless of other factors worldwide, then what's empire? How does the US even have an empire? Why does it have this giant military? None of it make any sense. So I believe in the theory of super imperialism. So I don't really buy the whole MMT thing. What I would say is as well that the basic Keynesian understanding of this stuff historically has been that deficits are fine. Small deficits are fine, 3-4%. If you've got GDP growth of 2%, if you've got inflation of 2-3%, it really doesn't matter. Net, you're even, right? The problem for the UK right now is that we haven't had productivity growth for 18 years. We are, not generating more and more value in terms of hours worked. Actually, it's flatlining. Some years it's been going down over the last 18 years. We are an increasingly large net importer of energy because, of course, North Sea oil is running out. Our demographic profile is bad. We've been underinvesting in infrastructure as a percentage of GDP, even compared to the Europeans for a really long time, even compared to the French. So all the fundamentals in this country are really, really bad. The idea that you can just say MMT, it's kind of like abracadabra, okay? Just my view. I know some people can disagree in the chat. That's fine. We can have those conversations. I'd also want to say really, really quickly, there is something that Reeves can do, which is she can build stuff because they changed the fiscal rules precisely to build stuff. I think this government should be building HS2 all the way to Manchester. I think they should be doubling down on these big infrastructure projects precisely in order to catalyze some growth. Growth is not the answer. You can watch my interview recently with Jason Hickel about growth ultimately not being the destination that socialists should be looking to. But in the short to medium term, you could do that through building sustainable infrastructure, public transit, renewable energy, etc., borrowing to do that, borrowing for the future. They're not doing that. And they're not doing that because they're saying, well, they're too expensive, these projects. Fine. Manage them to be cheaper. Make that a matter of national, political, and dare I say, security urgency. That's where I would disagree with her. But you're absolutely right, Helena. This is decades in the making, this stuff. And it's certainly at least 14 years plus in the making, 15 years now, with the Tories after 2010. David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson could have built so much stuff which would have created so much future use value for people for hundreds of years right? Which is what people did when they built the railways in this country, when they built the London Underground, when they built bridges and houses. These are all things that have use value long after the people that built those things die. We've not done that, okay? And we're doing that less than other European countries. Go to a medium-sized French city. Go to Dijon. Look at the tram system. Then go to Derby or go to Portsmouth or go to Newport, similar-sized places. They don't look the same, folks. Hate to break it to you. We'll be talking to Zach Polanski in a few minutes. Before we do, final thoughts on this story, Helena?
When it comes to MMT, I'm perfectly amenable to a lot of these arguments, right? But one of the clear things that people like Warren Mosler and Stephanie Kelton set out with MMT is that the two things you have to understand is that spending should be used to mobilize real resources, which I think is perfectly reasonable when you look at the NHS and say we should spend more, regardless whether it's a deficit or not, to ensure that we are mobilizing the resources that is people who are too sick to work, who could be not too sick if they were better. Because that's a real resource that you're mobilizing by this deficit spending. For example, you look at construction, we need more, as you say, infrastructure, we can spend that, right? That's mobilizing a real resource. The other thing that's important, though, is that the one thing that puts pay to that, we have to start engaging in taxation, is when you're in an inflationary environment. And because of trade barriers that have been put up, and other things such as the climate crisis making it harder and making it more expensive for things like food production, those inflationary environments are going to be far, far more frequent. So there's a difference between just spending any amount of money, right? Like the reality of MMT that we can't really go bust because we're a sovereign currency issuer. That's all perfectly true. All of this kind of talk in the Telegraph and places like that, there's going to be an IMF bailout. Nonsense. I don't believe a word of that. But you're right to say that the two things you need to really account for are, is inflation high and are you maintaining currency value? And the currency looks okay at the moment. I think there's probably some room, but inflation is a real problem. And if they really do start helicopter moneying for things like welfare, that could exacerbate that inflationary pressure. And as we've seen from all the elections from the pandemic period onward, inflation is not a vote winner. So I don't think that they're going to look at that. But I think that the argument is a lot more nuanced than a lot of MMT proponents who are just saying we can spend as much as we want are saying. I would agree with you there.
We have had Stephanie Kelton on. Maybe it's time that Stephanie came back. Fascinating debate, but fundamentally, I think Rachel Reeves, let's go back to the politics of all of this. Rachel Reeves is in big trouble with this autumn budget. She's going to be massively unpopular. I was looking at opinion polling earlier on today. She's 1 point better off than Donald Trump. I think she's going to be significantly down on the Donald in 2 to 3 months' time.
If you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.